It started on a quiet Monday morning in downtown Atlanta, the kind of day that felt ordinary but somehow too still, like the air was waiting for something to go wrong. The federal courthouse stood tall in the middle of the city, its white columns glinting under the sun, its glass doors reflecting the rush of strangers who passed by every day. Inside, the air was cold, thick with the smell of polished floors and cheap coffee, the kind of smell that never left government buildings. It was a place built for order, rules, justice, and control. But that day, behind those marble walls, order was only an illusion. A woman named Althea stood outside those doors, gripping a worn black folder against her chest. She looked calm, but her heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. She had dressed carefully that morning, navy blazer, white blouse, her hair pinned neatly. She knew eyes would be on her the moment she walked in. Being a black woman in that building meant every small move could be read wrong. Too confident, and she'd be called arrogant. Too quiet, and they'd call her weak. She had learned to exist somewhere in between, just professional enough to be heard, but careful enough not to be noticed. She had worked as a clerk in the federal court for almost 5 years. Most days were long and thankless. Endless paperwork, whispers in the hallways, and men in suits who spoke to her as if she were invisible. She kept her head down. She told herself it was temporary, just a stepping stone toward law school. But lately something inside her had started to crack. The silence that once kept her safe now felt like a prison. She'd begun noticing things. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room, documents that didn't match the ones she filed, judges who smiled too easily when she passed. One judge in particular, Judge Thomas Everett. He was the kind of man people pretended to admire. In his 60s, tall and stern-faced, with a reputation for being both brilliant and brutal. To the public, he was a symbol of fairness. In the courthouse, he was feared. Everyone knew he played favorites. Young male clerks got promotions, older ones got ignored, and women, especially black women, were lucky if he even remembered their names. But Althea remembered everything. Every smirk. Every insult is disguised as a joke. Every time he cut her off in meetings or dismissed her work as clerical noise. Still, she stayed. She told herself she could survive it. She needed the job, needed the paycheck, needed the recommendation letter for law school that only he could write. But something changed that winter. It started with a file that shouldn't have existed, a sealed court document that somehow appeared on her desk. The case name meant nothing at first, but the signature at the bottom made her heart skip. Judge Everett's. The content inside made her stomach twist. It wasn't just a clerical mistake. It was a cover-up. Something involving payments, false testimony, and a defendant who had mysteriously been released before trial. She didn't know if it was corruption or a clerical mix-up, but she knew enough to understand it was dangerous. She tried to ignore it. She shoved the file back into her drawer and told herself she hadn't seen it. But the unease didn't go away. At night, she found herself replaying old conversations, remembering the way Everett's voice softened when he spoke about keeping the system clean, or how his hands trembled slightly when she mentioned audits. 2 weeks later, she made a mistake. She asked a question. It was small, casual even, about a form that didn't add up. But the moment she asked it, Everett's eyes locked on her, cold and sharp. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You don't need to worry about things above your clearance, Ms. James," he said, his smile tight. "You're here to type, not to think." The room fell silent. 2 other clerks stared down at their papers. Althea felt heat crawl up her neck, her chest tightening as if she'd been slapped. That moment stayed with her for days. The humiliation wasn't new, but this one cut deeper. It wasn't just disrespect. It was control. A message. A warning. She tried to move on, but the atmosphere in the courthouse had changed. People looked at her differently. Conversations stopped when she walked by. Files began disappearing from her desk, then reappearing with small notes. Wrong file. Watch yourself. The elevator rides grew quieter, and even the janitor, who used to greet her every morning, stopped making eye contact. She started feeling trapped inside those walls. The building that once felt so structured now felt alive, whispering, breathing, watching. She could feel Everett's presence even when he wasn't there, his shadow stretching down the hallways, over every desk, through every closed door. She began having nightmares, the sound of gavels slamming, papers flying, Everett's voice echoing through the courtroom, calling her name again and again. But Althea wasn't someone who broke easily. She'd been underestimated her whole life, through school, through jobs, through every quiet act of dismissal that told her she didn't belong. This was different, but familiar. The same game, just bigger stakes. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, she sat at her desk staring at the sealed file again. Her hands trembled as she flipped through it. Each page felt heavier than the last. Transahan, quiescence, signed orders, court transcripts altered. She knew what it meant. Everett wasn't just cruel, he was corrupt. And she was holding proof. The sound of footsteps made her freeze. Someone was walking toward her office, slow, deliberate. She shoved the file into her bag just as Everett appeared in the doorway. "Working late again?" His tone was almost casual, but his eyes weren't. They were calculating. "Just finishing up some filing," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. He stepped closer, too close. "You're a hard worker, Althea. But sometimes hard workers get distracted. It's best not to dig where you don't belong. Trust me." That night, when she drove home, her hands shook the whole way. She didn't know if he was threatening her or warning her, but she understood what he meant. And yet, even through the fear, something inside her hardened. She had spent her whole life trying to fit in, trying to stay silent so she could survive. But that silence had never protected her. It had only protected people like him. She didn't know it yet, but that night was the beginning of something irreversible. Within months, she would lose her job, her peace, and nearly her sanity. But she would also uncover a web of crimes that reached further than she ever imagined. Crimes that would turn the very system meant to protect people like her into her biggest enemy. And it all started with one file that should never have existed, and one woman who refused to stay quiet anymore. The weeks that followed felt like walking through fog. Every morning, Althea would force herself through the courthouse doors, clutching her ID badge as if it could protect her. She had always been good at reading people, but now she could feel something deeper. A shift, a quiet hostility pulsing through the walls. The smiles from co-workers had grown tighter. Conversations turned short. Even the air in the break room felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Everett's eyes were on her more often now. He never said much, but when he did, his words lingered like poison. "You're distracted lately, Ms. James," he said one afternoon during a staff meeting, his tone sharp but smooth. "If your heart's not in the work, perhaps you should reconsider your position." The room had gone silent. Everyone knew it wasn't really a suggestion. It was a warning, the kind that dressed itself as concern. She nodded politely, said nothing, and went back to her desk. But inside, something burned. She had spent her life learning how to swallow humiliation, but this one stuck in her throat. That night, when she got home, she sat at her kitchen table with the sealed file laid out in front of her. She couldn't stop reading it. Each time she went through it, new questions surfaced. Names of lawyers who shouldn't have been involved, missing pages, suspicious transfers. It was like staring into a puzzle that kept rearranging itself, always one step ahead of her. A part of her wanted to hand it over anonymously. She even drafted an email to a local reporter once. But then she thought about what Everett could do to her if he found out. He had power, not just over her job, but her career, her future. A single call from him could end any chance she had at law school. And worse, no one would believe her. She was just a clerk, a young black woman in a system built to doubt her voice. So she kept quiet. But quiet didn't mean still. She started copying documents. Small things at first, things no one would notice missing. She used her lunch breaks to make backups on an old USB drive she carried in her purse. The more she read, the deeper she got pulled in. The corruption wasn't small, it was systematic. There were falsified court orders, missing transcripts, and what looked like bribes disguised as processing fees. Everett's name wasn't the only one that appeared. A few lawyers, even another judge, were linked to the same trail of money. It was a network built on silence, hidden in plain sight. But the more Althea uncovered, the more dangerous her days became. One morning she came into work to find her office door slightly open. Nothing looked missing, but her desk drawers were different, not messy, not ransacked, but off. She could tell someone had gone through them carefully, almost respectfully. A single sticky note was left on her keyboard. It said only one word: enough. Her stomach turned cold. She tore it up, flushed it in the bathroom, and tried to convince herself it was a prank. But deep down, she knew better. The paranoia began to seep into her nights. She started checking her locks twice before sleeping, leaving lights on, glancing through her window at cars that idled too long outside. Her mother, who lived 2 states away, noticed the strain in her voice during their calls. "Baby, you sound tired," she said one evening. "You working too hard again?" Althea lied. "Just long hours, Mama, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Around this time, Everett began calling her into his office more often. Sometimes for small, pointless things, to ask for copies, to clarify a date on a document. Other times it felt deliberate, as if he was testing how far he could push her. His words were always wrapped in civility, but his tone was lined with mockery. "You're bright, Althea," he'd say, "but brightness without obedience is wasted." The more he spoke, the more she realized what kind of man he really was. He didn't just crave respect, he craved control. Every person under him was a pawn, and he enjoyed watching them struggle to please him. He fed off fear. One afternoon, a fellow clerk named Daniel caught up with her by the elevators. He was one of the few who hadn't turned cold toward her. His voice was low when he spoke. "You should be careful," he said. "Everett's been asking about you." She looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Daniel said. He's been calling your performance into question. Said you've been distracted. He's trying to build a case to get you transferred. Or worse." That night, Althea sat in her car for nearly an hour before driving home. Her chest felt heavy, like she was sinking in invisible weight. She had wanted justice, or maybe just truth. But now, all she could think about was survival. Still, she couldn't stop digging. She couldn't unsee what she'd seen. The following week, she noticed something strange. One of the sealed files she had copied was missing from the archive room. When she checked the digital record, the entry had been deleted completely, as if it never existed. Someone was cleaning up. Someone knew what she was doing. Her fear turned into anger. If they wanted her to stay quiet, they should never have humiliated her in the first place. But her anger made her reckless. She began emailing small portions of the evidence to herself from her work account, thinking no one would notice. She didn't realize the IT system logged every transfer. A few days later, she was summoned to Everett's office again. He didn't speak right away. He just stared at her, tapping a file on his desk. "You've been very busy," he said finally. "Care to explain these data logs?" Her mouth went dry. She tried to form words, but her throat felt locked. As backing up files. Routine stuff. He leaned back, smiling faintly. Routine? You're copying sealed records. That's not routine, Ms. James. That's a federal offense. Her heart dropped. She could hear it in his tone. He wasn't angry. He was enjoying this. I could have you arrested today, he continued, his voice quiet but sharp as glass. But I'm not unreasonable. I believe in second chances. Perhaps you just need to be reminded of your place. She left his office trembling. Her legs felt weak, her head dizzy. It wasn't just a threat anymore. He had her trapped. The next morning, she found that her computer login no longer worked. When she asked IT, they told her her access was temporarily restricted. By lunch, everyone in the office seemed to know. Some avoided her. Others looked at her with pity. A few smirked. It was clear. Everett had started his attack. Days later, HR called her in for a performance review. The meeting was short, and it didn't matter what she said. The decision had already been made. They put her on leave, citing conduct under review. It was humiliating, and Everett made sure to walk past the HR office as she packed her things, just to watch. When she got home that day, she sat in her apartment with the blinds closed, surrounded by silence. The courthouse had taken so much from her confidence, her career, her peace. But as she sat there, surrounded by copies of the files she had saved, she realized she still had one thing left. The truth. It wasn't just Everett anymore. The files linked him to several people, lawyers, prosecutors, even an FBI liaison. Money flowed between them through shell accounts. The corruption wasn't just a single man's greed. It was an entire system, protecting itself. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone. She dialed the number she had written weeks ago on a scrap of paper, a contact at the FBI's Atlanta field office. The woman on the other end sounded calm, professional. "This is Agent Parker. How can I help you?" For a moment, Althea couldn't speak. Her throat felt dry, her heart pounding. Then she said it, quietly but clearly. "I have evidence of judicial corruption." That call changed everything. The FBI didn't act right away. They needed proof, hard proof. They asked for names, files, and context. She met with them in secret, usually in small diners far from downtown. They listened, took notes, and asked careful questions. At first, she thought she could trust them. But soon, even that began to feel uncertain, because somehow the word started to get back to the courthouse. She began receiving strange calls at night. No voice, just breathing. Her car alarm went off 3 times in 1 week. Someone left a dead bird on her doorstep. Its neck twisted, feathers scattered. By the time the FBI began their formal inquiry, Althea was already unraveling. The pressure was crushing her. The fear of being exposed. The guilt of dragging others into it. The nightmares that made her wake up gasping. But the worst moment came when she saw Everett again. It was outside the courthouse, weeks after her suspension. He was standing on the steps, surrounded by reporters. He looked calm, polished, powerful, untouched. When his eyes met hers across the street, he smiled. Just a small, knowing smile. The kind that said, "You'll never win." That smile haunted her. It lit something inside her that no amount of fear could put out. She realized then that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting to expose every person who had used their power to silence people like her. Every system that had told her to sit down, stay quiet, and accept what she was given. The tension that had been building for months was about to break. She could feel it. Something in the air had changed, like the split second before a storm. And when it finally hit, It would destroy everything in its path. It was a Friday evening in early spring, when everything finally came undone. The sun was setting over Atlanta, casting a strange orange glow over the courthouse. That same building that had once represented order and control now felt like a fortress of corruption. Althea hadn't been inside for weeks, not since the day they suspended her. But tonight, she was going back, not to beg for her job, but to expose the man who had taken everything from her. The FBI had promised protection. Agent Parker had told her that the operation would be handled carefully, that Everett would be confronted with evidence they could no longer deny. Althea wasn't supposed to go near him. But that morning, she received a call that changed everything. It wasn't from the FBI. It was from Everett's assistant, a young woman who sounded nervous. "Judge Everett wants to see you," she said quietly. "He said it's urgent. Something about clearing your name." Althea's blood ran cold. She knew it was a trap, but something in her wouldn't let it go. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the part of her that needed to look him in the eye and know he couldn't scare her anymore. By the time she parked across the street from the courthouse, the sun had dipped behind the skyline. The building's windows glowed faintly under the streetlights, its marble steps empty and silent. The city outsea was still alive, cars honking, people laughing, life moving on. But here it felt like another world. Inside, the halls were quiet, too quiet. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, echoing through the corridors. The air was cold, smelling faintly of cleaning chemicals and old paper. She could hear the hum of fluorescent lights above her, the faint buzz of electricity in the walls. Everett's office door was open. He was sitting behind his desk, as if he'd been waiting. His jacket was off, his sleeves rolled up, a glass of whiskey beside him. He looked calm, too calm. "Ms. James," he said, his tone smooth and heavy. "You've caused quite a storm." She stood in the doorway, not moving. "I'm not here to play games," she said. "You know what you've done." He smiled faintly. "What have I done?" "My dear, I think you've misunderstood. You broke the law. You stole confidential documents. You've embarrassed this court. And you think anyone will believe your story over mine?" Her pulse quickened. "I gave the FBI everything," she said. "Every file, every document. They know what you are." For the first time, his smile faltered. It was slight, but she saw it. The crack in his composure. "The FBI?" he said, leaning forward. "You mean the same people who dine with me every week? The same people whose careers I've protected?" Her stomach dropped. He stood up slowly, walking around the desk toward her. His tone softened, almost kind. "You've made a moth for yourself, Althea, but I can fix it. I always fix things. All you have to do is give me those files, all of them, and this can disappear. You can have your job back. I'll even write that law school recommendation you wanted so badly." The way he said it made her skin crawl. Every word felt like poison disguised as mercy. She shook her head. "You don't scare me anymore." He took another step closer, his voice dropping. "You should be scared. You don't understand how deep this goes. People much more powerful than I will come after you. You're nothing but a clerk who overstepped." She felt her throat tighten, but she didn't back down. "You're done, Everett. You'll answer for what you've done." Something in his face changed. The calm mask slipped away, replaced by something darker, something raw and furious. "You think you can destroy me?" he hissed. "After everything I built?" He slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. The whiskey glass toppled over, spilling across his papers. She flinched, but didn't move. "I don't need to destroy you," she said quietly. You already did that yourself." For a second they just stared at each other. The air between them felt alive, charged with something dangerous. Then in one sharp motion, Everett reached into his drawer. Althea froze. He pulled out a gun, small, black and cold-looking in the dim light. "Sit down," he ordered. Her heart raced. "You're not going to shoot me," she said, though her voice shook. He cocked the gun. "You've left me no choice. You think anyone will believe I killed you?" "No, no. They'll believe you broke in, that you attacked me. You're unstable, desperate. I'll be the victim." Her breath came in short gasps. She could feel her knees trembling, her mind racing. The door behind her felt miles away. "Please," she whispered, "you don't have to do this." But he didn't lower the gun. His hand trembled slightly, his jaw tight. "You ruined everything. Everything I worked for. Do you even know what it's like to be judged by people beneath you? To be surrounded by incompetence and corruption and know you're the only one keeping it all from falling apart?" His voice cracked, half rage, half confession. He wasn't just defending himself. He was unraveling. She took a slow step back. "You're not keeping it together, Everett. You're just covering your sins." He raised the gun higher. "You don't know what I've done for this system." The sound that followed was deafening. A single shot tore through the room, echoing off the walls. For a moment, the world froze. The smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air, the ringing in her ears so loud she couldn't tell if she'd been hit. When she looked down, the bullet had missed her, lodged in the wall beside the door. Everett's hand shook violently. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. She didn't think. She ran. The hallway stretched before her like a tunnel. Her heels slipped against the tile as she sprinted, her lungs burning. She could hear his footsteps behind her, fast and uneven. The gun fired again, the sound echoing through the marble corridor. She didn't look back. She pushed through the stairwell door, stumbled down the steps, clutching the railing. Her hands were slick with sweat, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Another shot rang out, splintering the wall beside her. She screamed, but kept running. By the time she reached the ground floor, her legs felt like lead. She burst through the emergency exit, out into the cold night air. Sirens wailed in the distance, faint but growing. She didn't know if someone had called them, or if fate had intervened, but she ran toward the sound. Behind her, the courthouse doors slammed open. Everett stumbled out, his gun still in hand. For the first time he looked truly unhinged, his face red, his eyes wild. "Althea," he shouted, "you don't understand. They'll destroy me." But she didn't stop. A squad car pulled into the street, lights flashing. 2 officers jumped out, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon!" one shouted. Everett turned toward them, disoriented, panicked. For a split second it looked like he might surrender. Then, almost as if realizing there was no escape, he lifted the gun, not at them, but at himself. Althea screamed, "No!" The shot echoed across the street, sharp and final. He fell, backward onto the courthouse steps, the gun clattering beside him. The officers rushed forward, but it was too late. The marble beneath him ran dark. Althea stood frozen, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her vision blurred, her ears still ringing. She could smell the smoke from the gun, the faint metallic scent of blood. People had gathered across the street, faces lit by flashing red and blue lights, but it all felt distant, unreal. One of the officers approached her gently. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She couldn't answer. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The courthouse towered behind her, its white columns streaked with the glow of police lights. It looked smaller now, stripped of its authority, just another building hiding broken men and darker truths. As they led her to the ambulance, she turned back one last time. Everett's body lay motionless at the top of the steps, the man who had once ruled over that building now silent, his own corruption swallowing him whole. For months, she had lived in fear of him. And now, seeing him lifeless, she felt no victory, only exhaustion, only grief for the parts of herself he had taken before he died. The night air was cool against her face. Somewhere far away, she heard Agent Parker shouting orders, the sound of cameras clicking, radios buzzing. But Althea's mind was somewhere else, back in the moments before the first gunshot, when there might still have been a chance to walk away. There was no triumph in what had happened, only the hollow truth that justice had come too late, and that in a system built on silence and power, even the innocent had to bleed to be heard. The days after the shooting felt like a blur, a haze of sirens, headlines, and sleepless nights that refused to end. Atlanta woke up to chaos the next morning. News vans crowded the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions into microphones, their voices full of disbelief. "Federal judge dead in apparent suicide," the headlines screamed. "Whistleblower Clark escapes assassination attempt." For the first time, Althea's name was everywhere. On television screens, in newspapers, on social media. They called her brave. They called her a hero. But she didn't feel like one. She hadn't saved anyone. She had survived, barely, and that didn't feel like victory. It felt like something hollow and heavy, something she didn't yet have the words for. The FBI took her into protective custody that weekend. Agent Parker met her in a quiet motel on the edge of the city, away from cameras and curious eyes. She looked exhausted, hair tied back, dark circles under her eyes. "You did the right thing," Parker said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Everett's files are going to blow this open. You've exposed something huge." But Althea didn't answer. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. They still shook sometimes, out of nowhere. Her mind replayed that night in flashes, the echo of the gunshot, the look in Everett's eyes before he pulled the trigger, the silence afterward. It came to her in dreams, always ending the same way, with her standing on those courthouse steps, unable to move, as the blood spread wider and wider beneath him. She wanted to feel relief. Instead, she felt guilty. Not for what she'd done, but for what it had cost. She hadn't wanted him dead. She had wanted him exposed. There was a difference, but no one cared about that now. The story had taken on a life of its own. In the days that followed, the investigation widened. The files Althea had collected confirmed years of corruption, falsified court records, hidden payments, and criminal cover-ups stretching far beyond Everett's courtroom. His death forced everyone's hand. Dozens of names surfaced. Some resigned quietly. Others denied everything, calling Everett a misunderstood man under immense pressure. The courthouse became a war zone of whispers. Judges avoided eye contact in the hallways. Clerks deleted emails. Everyone was afraid to speak. The same people who had once worshipped Everett now pretended not to have known him. Outside, the public had already made up its mind. Some saw Everett as a monster who had finally faced justice. Others painted him as a tragic figure, a man crushed by the weight of his position. Talk shows debated his legacy, twisting his crimes into questions of morality and mental health. Through it all, Althea watched from the sidelines, hidden in a borrowed apartment, her world reduced to closed blinds and static news feeds. She was safe, but she wasn't free. Every sound made her jump. Every car that slowed near the building made her heart race. The FBI offered counseling, but she could barely speak about what had happened. How could she explain the way guilt and anger tangled inside her? She had spent months fighting to be heard, but now that everyone was listening, she wanted nothing more than silence. Her mother came to see her a week later. The reunion was tearful but strained. "You did what was right," her mother said softly, holding her hands. "You told the truth." Althea nodded, but her throat tightened. "It doesn't feel right," she whispered. "It just feels over." Her mother squeezed her hand tighter. "It's not over, baby. It's just the part where people start listening. But the world wasn't listening for long. By the next month, the story began to fade. New scandals took over the headlines. The investigation continued quietly, away from cameras. A few low-level staffers were charged, a few lawyers were disbarred, but the bigger names, the ones who benefited most, slipped away untouched. They always did. Everett's funeral became a public spectacle. Cameras lined the cemetery gates. Colleagues spoke about his dedication to justice. No one mentioned the files. No one mentioned the gun. His widow, pale and motionless, stood at the front of the crowd, her hands clasped tightly around the flag folded over his casket. Althea watched the coverage from the motel TV. She couldn't look away. There he was, the man who had tormented her, humiliated her, tried to kill her, being buried with full honors, remembered as a pillar of the judiciary. She turned the TV off halfway through the broadcast. For the first time since his death, she cried. Not for him, but for the truth that would never be fully seen. The psychological toll weighed on her in ways she hadn't expected. Simple things became hard. Sleeping through the night, walking into public places, trusting anyone in a suit. She'd go to the grocery store and freeze when someone raised their voice. She'd see men who looked like Everett on the street and feel her breath catch. Agent Parker checked in regularly, trying to keep her grounded. "We're close to indictments," she'd say. "You did more than you think." But each update felt emptier than the last. The deeper the investigation went, the more it seemed like the system was patching itself up, not cleaning itself out. A few months later, a journalist reached out to her. A young woman from a local paper who wanted to write the real story. Althea hesitated for days before agreeing. When they finally met in a small cafe, she was quiet at first. But once she started talking, the words spilled out. The humiliation, the fear, the silence, the way power had protected Everett even in death. The article came out a week later. It wasn't loud or sensational. It was calm, painful, human. It painted Althea not as a hero, but as a survivor. A woman who had stood up to a broken system and barely made it out alive. The piece went viral. People began sharing her story again, this time with empathy instead of judgment. But even as her name became a symbol, Althea felt disconnected from it. The woman in those headlines didn't feel like her anymore. She was still healing, still waking up every morning to the echo of a gunshot that wouldn't leave her mind. Months turned into a year. The FBI's final report was long and full of complicated language. It confirmed what Althea had risked everything to expose, that Everett had taken bribes, manipulated verdicts, and obstructed justice for years. But it also revealed how many people had looked the other way. There were no heroes in the end, just survivors. When she finally walked back into the courthouse for the last time, it was almost empty. She had been called to give a final statement. The air was the same, cold, sterile, but the place felt smaller now, less powerful. As she stood in the hallway, she caught her reflection in the glass doors. She didn't look like the same woman who used to work there. There was something steadier in her eyes, something that had survived the fire. Before leaving, she walked past Everett's old office. The nameplate had been removed, and the door was open, left ajar. The desk was gone, the shelves empty. Just an echo of a man who had believed himself untouchable. For a long moment she stood there, letting the silence settle. Then she whispered, "It's over." Outside, the city moved on. Cars honking, people laughing, the world still turning. She stepped into the sunlight, the first real warmth she had felt in months. The scars were still there, the fear, the sleepless nights, the anger, but beneath them was something new. Not peace exactly, but a quiet kind of strength. Everett had tried to erase her. Instead, she became the reason people began asking questions about the system he had corrupted. Judges were reviewed more carefully. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. It wasn't everything she'd hoped for, but it was something. Proof that the truth once spoken could still shake the ground it stood on. And though she would never forget the sound of that final gunshot, she carried something else with her too, the memory of standing her ground, of refusing to stay silent. For the first time in a long time, Althea felt free, not from fear, but from the hold he'd had on her. The courthouse behind her stood tall and silent, but this time she didn't look back. Months passed, and the echoes of that night began to fade, at least in the headlines. The courthouse had been cleaned, repainted, and reopened. The bullet hole in the marble floor was patched over, as though nothing had ever happened. But for those who lived through it, the scars were harder to hide. Judge Everett's name still lingered in whispers. A cautionary tale, a tragic story of power corrupted. His death had forced the justice system to look inward, however briefly, at its own hypocrisy. Committees were formed, reports written, promises made. But real change came slowly, dragging behind the inertia of politics and pride. For Althea, life moved on, unevenly, quietly. The whistleblower hearings concluded, and she was officially cleared of any wrongdoing. Her testimony had helped convict two of Everett's closest allies for obstruction of justice, but the higher figures, those in polished offices with perfect smiles, were never touched. They had enough power to survive the storm. They always did. Still, she found a kind of bittersweet satisfaction in knowing the truth had been spoken aloud, even if imperfectly. Her words were now part of the record, unalterable, undeniable. She could live with that. She didn't return to law immediately. The courthouse, with its cold walls and forced smiles, had become a place of ghosts. Instead, she began working with a non-profit that supported whistleblowers and victims of workplace abuse. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt meaningful. Each time she sat with someone terrified to tell their story, she saw pieces of herself in their trembling hands and uncertain eyes. "People think the truth sets you free," she told one young intern once. "It doesn't, not right away. First it breaks you. Then, slowly, it starts to rebuild what's left." The FBI's investigation ended almost a year after the shooting. Their report detailed decades of corruption, altered case outcomes, missing evidence, and systematic abuse of power. But it also revealed the cracks in the system that allowed it all to thrive. The silence of subordinates, the complacency of peers, the worship of authority. When the report became public, the backlash was immediate. The media called it the fall of a judge. Commentators debated the moral decay of the judiciary. Politicians promised reform. Yet beneath the outrage, the story had a strange duality. Some still sympathized with Everett, painting him as a man destroyed by stress and betrayal. Others saw him for what he was, a predator who hid behind the law. It was this divide that haunted Althea most. How easily society turned villains into martyrs when they wore suits and carried gavels. How quickly people forgot the victims once the cameras stopped rolling. She attended therapy for months, working through the trauma, the noise of the gunshot, the fear of being followed, the guilt of surviving. "You can't fix what happened," her therapist reminded her often. "You can only decide who you become after it." And slowly she did. Althea began writing again, this time not legal briefs, but essays, reflections on corruption, silence, and the dangerous seduction of power. Her words found a following online. People from all walks of life reached out, clerks, interns, teachers, even police officers, all of them sharing stories of how systems had failed them too. It became clear that Everett's story wasn't unique. It was part of something larger, a symptom of how easily authority becomes abuse when no one dares to question it. One evening, she returned to the courthouse for a speaking event. The air inside felt different now, lighter somehow. She stood at the same podium where Everett had once delivered verdicts and spoke about integrity, fear, and the cost of silence. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she went on. "Justice," she said, "isn't just what happens in this room. It's what happens when people stop believing they're powerless." The audience was quiet, moved. Some even cried. But for Althea, the real victory wasn't applause. It was knowing that her story no longer belonged to tragedy. It belonged to truth. Everett's widow, Claire, had moved away after the funeral. Rumors said she sold their mansion and left the city altogether. She gave no interviews, no statements. In time, she too became a footnote, another casualty of Everett's ambition. Agent Parker was promoted after the case. She remained in touch with Althea, though less frequently as the years passed. Their conversations were simple, check-ins mostly, but there was mutual respect there, born of shared experience. Every so often, a new scandal would break in the news. A crooked prosecutor, a police cover-up, a judge exposed for bias, and Althea would feel that familiar weight return. It reminded her that corruption wasn't confined to one man or one courthouse. It was systemic, human, and ongoing. But unlike before, she didn't feel helpless anymore. She had seen what truth could do, even in fragments. She had seen how one voice, no matter how small, could shake walls that seemed unbreakable. In time, she visited Everett's grave. It was a simple stone tucked at the far end of the cemetery. Someone had left flowers. Maybe his wife. Maybe one of his colleagues. Guests trying to ease their guilt. Althea stood there for a while, unsure what she wanted to say. Finally she whispered, "You almost won." Then after a pause, "But not completely." The wind carried her words away, soft and final. As she left, she realized that closure doesn't always come with forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from acceptance, from knowing that justice, however flawed, had still found a way to breathe through the cracks. The broader world learned from Everett's downfall in its own uneven way. The case sparked discussions about accountability and ethics across the judiciary. Whistleblower protections were reviewed. Law students studied the case as a modern example of moral decay within institutions of power. It became a story not just of a man's corruption, but of a woman's courage to confront it. In the end, that was the legacy that endured. Not Everett's name carved on a gravestone, but Althea's quiet defiance. Her refusal to be silenced by fear or power. Her life had been irrevocably changed. She would never again look at the world with the same naive faith in authority. But she had gained something deeper, the strength to question, to stand, to speak. The story of Judge Everett and Althea wasn't one of perfect justice. It was one of human justice, flawed, painful, incomplete, yet still vital. It revealed that morality is rarely black and white, and that power, when unchecked, corrodes even the brightest minds. And as Althea watched the city skyline one final time before leaving Atlanta for good, she thought of everything she had lost and everything she had found in its place. Truth, freedom, resolve. In the distance, the courthouse lights flickered against the night sky. No longer symbols of authority, but reminders of how fragile and necessary justice truly is. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, the air cool and steady. The past was no longer her prison. It was her proof that even in the darkest rooms, one voice could still ignite a reckoning.